"You got fat," he said, and the whole cafe laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world, like my body was a joke, like I was something easy to point at and forget. And for a second I just stood there with my fingers wrapped around a paper cup that had already gone cold, my other hand resting low on my stomach, subtle, protective, instinctive, a habit I hadn't even realized I'd formed, because I wasn't fat, not really, not in the way he meant, but I wasn't ready to explain that, not to him, not to anyone, not here under bright cafe lights that made everything feel sharper than it should, louder than it should, more real than I wanted it to be. And Tyler leaned back in his chair like he owned the moment, like he always had, his smile wide, careless, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten, because I used to know that smile, used to think it meant something safe, something mine, but now it just felt small, like something I had outgrown without realizing it, like shoes that didn't fit anymore, but still left blisters when I tried to wear them again. And the people around him laughed too, not because it was funny, but because it was easy, because it was easier to laugh than to look away, easier to join than to question, and I felt every pair of eyes slide over me, down my oversized sweater, over the way I stood a little differently now, a little slower, a little more careful, like I was carrying something fragile even when I wasn't thinking about it, and maybe I was. Maybe I always was now, because my world had changed in a way I hadn't said out loud yet, in a way that didn't fit into conversations about coffee orders and weekend plans, in a way that made everything else feel smaller, quieter, less important. And Tyler wasn't done. Of course he wasn't. He never was when he had an audience. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice just loud enough to carry, just soft enough to sound like he thought he was being clever. "Guess no one else wanted you. Huh?" And something inside me flinched, not from the words, but from the familiarity of them, from the way they echoed old arguments, old nights, old versions of myself that had believed him, that had believed I needed his approval to be enough, that had thought love sounded like control and criticism and waiting for him to decide I was worth staying for. And I almost said something, almost defended myself, almost explained, but the words stayed stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. Because what was I supposed to say? That I was 8 weeks pregnant, that my body was changing for a reason that had nothing to do with him, that the life I was carrying didn't belong to the version of me he thought he knew, that everything had shifted the night I walked away from him and into something I still didn't fully understand, something bigger, something dangerous in a way that didn't feel loud but felt inevitable, and my grip tightened on the cup until the lid bent slightly under the pressure, a small crack, a quiet sound, but it grounded me, reminded me I was still here, still standing, still in control of at least one thing, and I turned to leave, because that was the only thing that made sense, because staying meant giving him more of me than he deserved, more of me than I was willing to give anymore. And I took one step, then another, feeling the weight of the room shift behind me, the laughter fading into something thinner, something uncertain, and then I heard it, the scrape of a chair, sharp, deliberate, the kind of sound that didn't belong in casual moments, the kind that made people look up without knowing why. And a voice cut through the space, low, controlled, impossible to ignore. "Take your hand off her." And I froze, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said, like it wasn't a suggestion, like it wasn't a request, like it was a line that had already been crossed and was now being corrected. And I turned slowly, my heart picking up in a way that had nothing to do with Tyler anymore. Nothing to do with the cafe or the people or the humiliation that had filled the room just seconds ago, because the energy had changed, completely, suddenly, like someone had dimmed the lights without touching the switch, and he was there, standing a few feet away, closer than I remembered him ever being in. A place like this, closer than I thought he would ever choose to be, Sebastian Moretti. And even thinking his name felt like stepping into something I couldn't quite define, something that didn't fit into the life I had before, something that made everything around him feel quieter, smaller, less important. And he wasn't looking at Tyler, not even a glance, not even acknowledgement. His attention was on me, entirely, completely, like the rest of the room didn't exist, like I was the only variable he was calculating. And that should have made me nervous, should have made me step back, should have made me question why he was here, why he was involved, why he was looking at me like that. But instead it did something else, something unexpected. It steadied me, just slightly, just enough to make me realize I wasn't as alone in that moment as I had been seconds before, and Tyler laughed again, a little forced this time, a little louder than necessary. "Who the hell are you?" But Sebastian didn't answer. Not him, not the question, not the challenge, because it wasn't worth it, because Tyler wasn't the point, and that was the first moment I understood something I hadn't put into words yet. Power didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need to argue or explain. It just existed, and people either recognized it or they didn't, and Tyler didn't, not yet. And maybe that was his mistake, because Sebastian took a single step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, just deliberate, closing the space between us in a way that felt intentional, measured, like he was adjusting something invisible until it aligned the way he wanted it to. And then his gaze dropped, just for a second, not to my face, not to my hands, but lower, to the place where my sweater fell a little differently now, to the place where my hand had been resting moments ago, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I did. I felt it, like a change in temperature, like the air had gotten heavier, more focused, more certain, and before I could think about it, before I could decide if I should step back or speak or leave, his hand lifted, slow, controlled, giving me time to react, giving me space to refuse, but I didn't move. I couldn't, not because I was frozen, but because something in me recognized the intention behind the motion, recognized the lack of force, the absence of demand, and his palm rested lightly against my stomach, barely there, barely touching, but enough to send a quiet shock through me, enough to make everything else fade out for a second, the voices, the cafe, Tyler, all of it, and his voice dropped even lower when he spoke, meant for me and only me, how far along? And the question landed heavier than anything Tyler had said, heavier than the laughter, heavier than the stares, because it wasn't an insult, it wasn't a guess, it was a certainty, and my breath caught, my mind scrambling to catch up with what that meant, with what he was saying without saying, with what he had just recognized without being told, and behind us Tyler scoffed, confused now, irritated. "Are you serious right now?" But Sebastian didn't move, didn't look away, didn't acknowledge him, because he wasn't part of this moment anymore, and I realized then that the world had shifted in a way I couldn't undo, in a way I couldn't step back from, and the truth I had been holding in, the one I hadn't said out loud to anyone, the one that had felt too big, too complicated, too dangerous to share, slipped out before I could stop it, soft, almost a whisper, 8 weeks, and for a second nothing happened, no reaction, no movement, just silence, and then something in Sebastian's eyes. Settled, something final, something that felt like a decision had just been made without my input, without my permission, without my understanding, and he leaned closer, not enough to invade, just enough to make sure I heard him clearly, just enough to make sure there was no confusion about what came next. "Then we don't have time." The words stayed in the air longer than they should have, like everything else had been muted except for him, except for the quiet certainty in his voice that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, and I realized I had not stepped back, had not moved away from his hand still resting lightly against me, like part of me had already accepted something I had not fully understood yet, and then the world rushed back. And all at once, the sound of cups clinking, chairs shifting, people whispering like they were watching something they did not have permission to see, and Tyler pushed his chair back hard enough that it scraped loudly against the floor. "You have got to be kidding me," he said, louder now, trying to pull attention back to himself, trying to regain control of a moment that had slipped out of his hands without him realizing it. "Ava, what is this? Who is this guy?" And for the first time since he had spoken, I looked at him, really looked, and I saw it clearly, the confusion, the irritation, the disbelief, but underneath all of that, something else, something smaller, something fragile, like the beginning of understanding that he was no longer the center of anything that mattered, and I should have felt something, anger, satisfaction, maybe even relief, but all I felt was distance, like I was watching a version of my past try to catch up to a future it did not belong in, and Sebastian finally moved, slowly, deliberately, his hand lifting away from me, not abruptly, not possessive, just controlled, like he had already taken what he needed from that moment and did not need to hold on any longer. And when he spoke again, his voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried in a way that made people stop pretending not to listen. "You should not raise your voice at her," he said, not looking at Tyler directly, but not ignoring him either, like Tyler was simply part of the environment, something to be acknowledged but not engaged with. And Tyler laughed again, but it was different this time. Thinner, sharper, or what? He shot back, stepping forward, trying to reclaim space, trying to make himself bigger than he was, and I felt my body tense automatically, a reflex I had learned over time, a way of preparing for escalation even when nothing had happened yet. But Sebastian did not move, did not react, did not match the energy being thrown at him, and that contrast alone shifted everything, because power did not need to rise to meet noise. It let the noise burn itself out, and then it spoke, and when it did, it was final. "Or you leave," he said, simple, direct, and the certainty in those two words landed harder than anything else that had been said all day. And for a second Tyler just stared at him, like he was trying to decide whether to laugh it off or push further. But something in Sebastian's expression made that decision for him. Something in the way he held himself, completely still, completely sure, like the outcome had already been decided and Tyler just had not caught up to it yet. And the silence stretched, uncomfortable, heavy, until Tyler scoffed under his breath and stepped back, not fully retreating, not admitting anything, but shifting just enough that the tension broke, just enough that the room exhaled without realizing it had been holding its breath. And I did not notice I had been holding mine either until it left me in a slow, shaky release. And Sebastian turned back to me then, fully, like the rest of it had been a distraction, like the only thing that mattered was standing right in front of him. And that focus should have been overwhelming, but it was not. It was grounding in a way I could not explain, like he saw more than what was happening on the surface, like he understood something I had not said out loud yet. And I found my voice before I could second guess it. "You should not be here," I said quietly, because that was the truth, because none of this made sense in the world I had been living in, because he belonged somewhere else, somewhere controlled and distant and far removed from places like this, from moments like this, and his gaze did not shift, did not soften, did not harden, it just stayed steady. "And you should not be here alone," he replied, just as quietly, and that landed in a way I was not prepared for, because it was not a command, not a criticism, not even a question. It was an observation, a fact, something he believed without needing to justify it. And I shook my head slightly, instinctively pushing back against something I could feel forming, something bigger than I was ready to accept. "I am fine," I said, the words automatic, familiar, the same ones I had used for years to close conversations, to avoid questions, to maintain control over my own narrative. But something in his expression told me he did not believe it. Not in a dismissive way, not in a challenging way, just in a quiet, certain way, like he had already accounted for that answer before I gave it. And he glanced down again, briefly, not staring, not intrusive, just acknowledging what had already been said, what had already been revealed. And when his eyes came back to mine, there was something new there, not softer, not kinder, but more deliberate, like a decision had been made, and he was already moving forward with it. "You have not seen a doctor yet," he said, and it was not a question, and my breath caught again because he was right, because I had been avoiding it, because making it real in a clinical, measurable way felt like crossing a line I could not uncross, and I did not answer, did not confirm or deny, but the silence said enough, and he nodded once, like that was all he needed, like he had expected that too, and then he stepped back, just enough to create space. Just enough to shift the moment into something else, something that felt less like confrontation and more like transition, and he reached into his jacket, pulling out a simple card, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed importance, just clean, minimal, controlled, and he held it out to me, not forcing it into my hand, not closing the distance, just offering. And I hesitated for half a second before taking it, my fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment, and even that felt intentional. Measured, like nothing about him was accidental, and I looked down at the card, at the name printed there, at the number beneath it, and it felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just contact information, like it carried expectation, possibility, consequence. And when I looked back up, he was already watching me, already assessing, already waiting. "You will call me," he said, not a demand, not a question, just a statement delivered with quiet certainty. And I opened my mouth to respond, to push back, to reclaim some control over what was happening. But the words did not come, because part of me already knew that he was right, that this moment was not something I could walk away from and forget, that something had shifted in a way that would follow me long after I left this cafe. And behind us, Tyler let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh, trying one last time to insert himself back into a story that had moved past him. "This is insane," he muttered, but his voice did not carry the same weight anymore, did not hold the same power it had just minutes ago. And for the first time since I had walked in, I realized I was not shrinking under his words, not reacting to his tone, not measuring myself against his opinion. And that realization settled quietly, steadily, like something new taking root. And Sebastian held my gaze for one more second, just long enough to make sure I understood, just long enough to make it clear that this was not the end of anything, but the beginning of something I had not agreed to yet. And then he turned, moving away without hesitation, without looking back, like he trusted the outcome without needing to watch it happen. And I stood there with the card in my hand, the room slowly returning to normal around me, the noise, the movement, the conversations picking back up like nothing had happened. But everything had changed in a way I could feel but not yet define. And as I closed my fingers around the card, I realized something that made my heart beat just a little faster, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from something else entirely, something I was not ready to name, because for the first time since I had found out, I was not alone in it anymore. The card felt heavier the longer I held it, like it carried a weight that had nothing to do with paper or ink, and I stood there for a moment after he left, staring at the name printed in clean, precise letters, Sebastian Moretti, like saying it silently in my head might make it make sense, might explain why everything felt different now, why the air still felt charged even though the cafe had returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations picking back up, cups clinking, people pretending they had not just witnessed something they did not understand, and I became aware of my breathing again, slow, uneven, like I had been holding it for longer than I realized. And I slipped the card into my coat pocket without thinking, like my body had already decided something before my mind could catch up. And then I turned, ready to leave, ready to put distance between myself and everything that had just happened, because distance had always been my way of regaining control, of making things feel smaller, manageable. But I only made it 2 steps before Tyler's voice cut through again, closer this time, sharper. "You are not seriously going to walk away from me like that," he said, and there was something in his tone that felt familiar, something that used to pull me back, used to make me stop, used to make me turn around and explain myself, justify myself, stay. But this time it landed differently, like hearing an echo instead of a voice, like something that belonged to a version of me that was already fading. And I stopped, not because he told me to, but because I chose to, because I needed to close something properly, not for him, but for myself. And I turned slowly, meeting his eyes without hesitation, without the old reflex to soften, to accommodate, to make space for his reaction. And for a second, he looked almost relieved, like he thought this was going to follow the same pattern it always had, like I was going to apologize, explain, step back into a role he understood. But I did not say anything right away. I just looked at him, really looked, and I saw it clearly now, the way he filled silence with noise, the way he relied on attention to feel important, the way he mistook control for connection. And I realized something simple and undeniable. I had outgrown him long before I walked away. I had just not admitted it yet. And when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, unfamiliar even to me. "You do not get to talk to me like that anymore," I said, and the words landed between us with a quiet finality that felt more powerful than anything louder could have been. And his expression shifted, confusion first, then irritation, then something closer to disbelief. "What does that even mean?" He shot back, like he genuinely did not understand, like the idea of losing that dynamic had never occurred to him. And I felt a strange sense of clarity settle in my chest, like something had aligned that had been off for a long time. "It means I am not yours to comment on," I replied, simple, direct, no extra explanation, no emotional padding, just truth. And he let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You think you are better than me now?" he asked, And there it was again, the need to frame everything in terms of comparison, of hierarchy, of winning and losing, and I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, because it confirmed everything I had just realized, and I shook my head slightly. No, I said, I think I am just done, and that was the moment. Something broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a thread snapping under tension, and for a second he did not respond, like he had not expected that answer, like it did not fit into the script he had been following. And I turned again, this time without hesitation, without waiting for a reaction, without needing closure from him, because I had already given it to myself. And I walked out of the cafe into the cool afternoon air, the door closing behind me with a soft click that felt louder than it should have, like a boundary being set, like something ending cleanly for once. And I stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the outside world settle around me, the distant sound of traffic, the movement of people passing by, the normalcy of everything that had nothing to do with what had just happened, and my hand drifted back to my coat pocket, fingers brushing against the edge of the card, feeling its presence there like a reminder, like a question waiting to be answered, and I pulled it out again, looking at it more carefully this time, noticing the simplicity, the lack of unnecessary detail, just a name, a number, nothing else, like everything about it was intentional, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation, and I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been avoiding something, not just the doctor appointment, not just the reality of being 8 weeks pregnant, but the implications of him knowing, of him being involved, of what that might mean for the life I was trying to figure out on my own. And I told myself I did not need to call, that I could handle this, that I had been handling everything so far, that bringing him into it would complicate things in ways I could not predict. But even as I thought it, I knew it was not entirely true, because he was already part of it, already aware, already making decisions based on information I had not chosen to share, and the idea of ignoring that felt less like control and more like avoidance. And I hated that realization, hated that it made sense, hated that it left me standing here with a choice that did not feel optional anymore. And I glanced down at my watch, the time staring back at me in a way that felt suddenly significant, like every minute mattered more now, like everything had a different weight to it. And I thought about what he had said, "You have not seen a doctor yet," and the way he had not asked it as a question, the way he had already known, and something in that shifted my perspective, because it was not about control, not entirely. It was about awareness, about responsibility, about acknowledging something I had been trying to keep in a vague, undefined space. And I closed my eyes for a second, just long enough to steady myself, just long enough to make a decision I would not take back 5 minutes later. And when I opened them, the world looked the same, but I did not feel the same in it. And my thumb hovered over my phone as I pulled it out, the number already memorized from looking at the card for too long. And I told myself I was just calling for information, just to set boundaries, just to understand what he thought was so urgent. But I knew better. I knew this was not just a call, this was a step into something I did not fully understand yet, something that had already started whether I acknowledged it or not. And I pressed the number before I could overthink it, before I could talk myself out of it. And the phone rang once, twice, and then his voice came through, immediate, like he had been expecting it, like he had been waiting. "I was wondering how long it would take," he said, calm, certain. And I felt my heartbeat shift again, not from fear, not entirely, but from the undeniable realization that this was no longer just my story alone. His voice was steady on the other end of the line, like nothing about this surprised him, like my call was not a possibility, but an expectation already accounted for. And I swallowed before speaking, suddenly aware of how loud the city sounded around me. Cars passing, footsteps on pavement, fragments of conversation that felt distant compared to the weight of this moment. "You sound very sure of yourself," I said, trying to keep my tone even, trying to regain some sense of control over a situation that had shifted too quickly. And there was the faintest pause, not hesitation, just acknowledgement, like he had heard something beneath my words, something I had not fully intended to reveal. "I prefer certainty when it matters," he replied, calm, measured, and I exhaled slowly, my free hand tightening slightly at my side, grounding myself in something physical, something real. "You do not know me well enough to be certain about anything," I said, and this time I meant it, not as a challenge, but as a boundary, something I needed to establish before this went any further, and there was a subtle shift in his tone when he answered, not softer, not harsher, just more precise. I know enough, he said, and the way he said it made something in my chest tighten again, not from fear, but from the unsettling realization that he might be right in ways I had not considered, and I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see it. You know that I am pregnant, I corrected. That is not the same thing. And silence followed, not empty, not uncomfortable, just present, like he was choosing his next words carefully instead of reacting. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, but more deliberate. No, it is not. He agreed. And that simple acknowledgement caught me off guard more than anything else had, because I had expected resistance, expected him to assert more, to push harder, but instead he adjusted, like he was recalibrating based on what I had said, and that made me pause, made me reconsider the way I had framed this in my head, because this was not someone who forced outcomes. This was someone who shaped them, and that distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. Then why did you say we do not have time? I asked, the question coming out more direct than I intended, but I did not take it back, because I needed to understand what he meant, needed to know what he thought was so urgent, and I heard him exhale on the other end, slow, controlled, like he was considering how much to say, how much to reveal, and when he answered, his voice carried that same quiet certainty that had unsettled me from the start. Because time is not neutral in situations like this, he said, and I frowned slightly, trying to follow his meaning, trying to understand the layers behind what sounded like a simple statement. What does that mean? I asked, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just clarity. It means that every day you delay taking care of this, it becomes more complicated, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, something that made it clear he was not just talking about appointments or logistics. He was talking about consequences, about variables I had not accounted for, about a reality that extended beyond what I could see from where I was standing, and my grip on the phone tightened. Slightly. I can handle my own situation, I said, the words firm, automatic, a reflex built over years of relying on myself, and he did not contradict me, did not dismiss it. I did not say you could not, he replied, and that stopped me for a second, because again, he was not pushing against me, he was aligning with me while still holding his position. Then what are you saying? I asked, and this time his answer came without hesitation. I am saying you should not have to do it alone, he said, and the simplicity of that statement landed harder than anything else he had said, because it was not a command, not a demand, not even an assumption. It was an offer, and I realized I had not been expecting that, not from him, not from anyone, and for a moment I did not respond, because I did not know how to, because part of me wanted to reject it immediately, to protect the independence I had built, to maintain control over something that already felt uncertain, but another part of me, quieter, more honest, recognized the truth in what he was saying, recognized the weight I had been carrying alone, the decisions I had been postponing, the reality I had been keeping at a distance because facing it fully meant admitting that everything had changed, and I closed my eyes briefly, just long enough to steady my thoughts. I did not call you for help, I said finally, and my voice was softer now, not weaker, just more real, and there was no offense in his response, no shift in tone, just acknowledgement. I know, he said, and something about that made it harder to maintain the distance I had been trying to keep, because he was not misinterpreting my actions, he was seeing them clearly and choosing to respond anyway. Then why are you acting like this is your responsibility? I asked, and this time there was a slight pause, not uncertainty, but something closer to consideration, like he was deciding how direct to be, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before, something deeper, more personal, because it is, he said, simply, and my breath caught, not because I had not known that on some level, but because hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I could not ignore anymore, made it impossible to keep this separate. From him, from us, from whatever this was becoming, and I felt my heart pick up, not from fear, but from the shift in perspective, from the realization that this was no longer something I could define on my own. You do not get to decide that for me, I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended, a defense mechanism kicking in before I could stop it, and for the first time, there was a slight edge in his tone when he replied. Not anger, not frustration, just firmness. I am not deciding it for you, he said. I am acknowledging what already exists. And that stopped me completely, because it was true, because this was not something either of us had created intentionally, but it was something we both had to face now, whether we wanted to or not. And the silence that followed felt different this time, heavier, more significant, like we had crossed into a deeper understanding without fully articulating it. And I leaned back slightly against the cool brick of the building behind me, grounding myself again, feeling the texture against my skin, the reality of where I was, who I was, what was happening, and I took a slow breath. What do you want from me? I asked, and the question felt bigger than it sounded, because it was not just about logistics or plans, it was about expectations, about boundaries, about how much of my life I was willing to let him into, and his answer came without hesitation, without complication. For you to come with me, he said, and my eyes opened immediately, the words landing with a clarity that cut through everything else. Where? I asked, and there was no ambiguity in his response, no room for misinterpretation. To see a doctor, he said, calm, certain, like this was the next logical step, like everything else could wait until that was handled, and I felt a mix of resistance and relief rise at the same time, conflicting emotions pulling in opposite directions, because part of me wanted to say no, to maintain control, to prove that I could do this on my own terms, but another part of me, quieter but stronger, recognized the truth in what he was offering, recognized the urgency I had been avoiding, recognized that this was not just about me anymore. And I looked down at the card still in my hand, at the name that had already changed the course of my day in ways I had not expected, and I realized something I could not ignore. This decision was not about control anymore. It was about responsibility. And for the first time since I had found out, I felt the weight of that fully settle in, not as fear, but as something steadier, something that required action. And when I spoke again, my voice was quieter, but more certain than it had been before. When? I asked, and on the other end of the line, I could almost hear the shift, the confirmation of something he had already anticipated. Now, he said, and the word hung between us, simple, immediate, impossible to postpone, and I closed my eyes for a second, just long enough to let that reality settle in, just long enough to understand that everything was about to change again, and this time, I was choosing to step into it. The word stayed with me long after the call ended, simple and absolute. Now, and I stood there for a second longer than I should have, phone still in my hand, the city moving around me like nothing had shifted while everything inside me had, and I realized I had not said yes, not out loud, but I also had not said no, and somehow that felt like an answer all on its own, because he had not waited for confirmation, had not asked if it worked for me. He had simply stated it like the next step had already been decided, like time was something we could not negotiate with, and before I could overthink it, before I could build a list of reasons to delay, a black car pulled up to the curb in front of me, smooth, quiet, deliberate, like it had been sent the moment I made the call, like he had anticipated not just my decision, but the timing of it, and my breath caught slightly as the driver stepped out, dressed in a way that did not draw attention, but somehow commanded it anyway, opening the back door with a subtle nod. Miss Brooks, he said, and that alone was enough to send a quiet realization through me. He knew exactly who I was, not just my name, not just the fact that I was pregnant, but me, specifically, and I hesitated for half a second, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that stepping into that car meant crossing a line I would not be able to step back from, not easily, not cleanly, and my hand moved instinctively to my stomach again, a grounding gesture, a reminder of why this mattered more than my hesitation, more than my need for control, and I exhaled slowly before stepping forward, sliding into the car with a sense of calm that surprised me. Like my body had already accepted what my mind was still processing, and the door closed behind me with a soft, final sound, sealing the decision in a way that felt heavier than it should have, and the car pulled away from the curb without hesitation, merging into traffic smoothly, like this was just another part of a routine that had been executed many times before, and I sat there for a moment, hands resting in my lap, aware of the quiet around me, the absence of unnecessary noise, the controlled environment that felt so different from the unpredictability of the cafe just minutes ago, and I realized something slowly. This was his world, precise, intentional, nothing left to chance, and I was stepping into it without fully understanding what that meant. And I glanced out the window as the city shifted around us, familiar streets giving way to something else, something more refined, more contained, and my thoughts drifted back to the call, to the way he had spoken, the way he had not asked but expected, and I tried to decide if that bothered me or reassured me. But the answer was not simple, because it was both. It challenged the independence I had built, but it also offered a stability I had not realized I needed. And that contradiction sat quietly in my chest as the car slowed, turning into a private drive that I had never noticed before despite passing through this part of the city countless times. And the building ahead was understated but unmistakably exclusive, clean lines, glass and stone, security that was visible without being intrusive, and the driver stepped out again, opening the door for me with the same calm efficiency, and I stepped onto the pavement, taking in the space around me, the stillness of it compared to the noise I had left behind, and before I could process further, I felt it, that shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, and I turned slightly, already knowing who I would see before my eyes confirmed it. And there he was, standing a few feet away, exactly as composed as he had been before, like time had not passed for him the way it had for me, like he had been waiting in that same stillness since the moment I hung up the phone. And something about that steadiness grounded me in a way I had not expected, and he stepped closer, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, and his eyes moved over me briefly, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt assessing, like he was confirming something, like he was making sure I was exactly as he had anticipated, and then his gaze settled on mine. "You came," he said, simple, factual, but there was something beneath it, not surprise, not relief. Something quieter, something that felt like acknowledgement, and I nodded slightly, because there was nothing else to say, nothing that would add to what was already understood between us, and he held my gaze for a second longer before speaking again. "We should not waste time," he said, and there it was again, that focus on urgency, that refusal to let things drift into uncertainty, and I felt a small part of me push back against it, against the pace, against the way everything seemed to move according to his timeline. But I also felt something else, something steadier, something that recognized the importance of what we were about to do, and I followed him inside without argument, the doors opening quietly as we approached, the transition from outside to inside seamless, like everything here was designed to remove friction, to create a sense of ease even when the situation itself was anything but, and the interior was just as controlled, just as precise, clean surfaces, muted colors, a sense of calm that felt intentional rather than natural, and I became aware of how out of place I should have felt, how different this was from my usual environment. But strangely, I did not feel uncomfortable. I felt aware, like every detail mattered here, like every step had a purpose, and we moved through the space without interruption, no waiting, no checking in, like our presence had already been accounted for, like everything had been prepared in advance. And that realization settled in slowly. He had arranged this before I even agreed, before I even fully understood what I was stepping into. And that should have bothered me, should have made me question the lack of control, but instead it made me realize something else. He was not reacting to this situation. He was anticipating it, managing it, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. And we stopped outside a door that looked no different from the others, simple, unmarked. But the moment we reached it, it opened, and a woman in a white coat greeted us with a calm, professional smile. "We have been expecting you," she said, and I felt my breath catch slightly at the words, not because they were surprising, but because they confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was not spontaneous. This was not last minute. This had been arranged with precision, and I glanced at him briefly, but he was already focused on the next step, already moving forward, and I followed, because at this point, there was no standing still, no waiting, no pretending this was something I could delay any longer. And as I stepped into the room, I felt it again, that shift, that awareness that everything was about to become real in a way I could not ignore, and my hand moved to my stomach once more, not out of habit this time, but out of something deeper, something that felt like acceptance, like readiness. And I realized something quietly. I had walked into this on my own, but I was not walking through it alone anymore. The room felt quieter than it should have, like even the air understood the weight of what was about to happen, and I stood just inside the doorway for a second, taking it in without really seeing it. The clean surfaces, the soft lighting, the faint hum of machines that sounded distant but constant, and the woman in the white coat gestured gently toward the examination chair, her movements calm, practiced, like she had done this 1,000 times before, and maybe she had, but not for me, not like this, not with everything that had led up to this moment pressing in from all sides. And I moved forward slowly, aware of each step, aware of him behind me, not close enough to touch, not distant enough to ignore, a presence that did not crowd, but did not disappear either. And that balance unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant he was choosing where to stand, choosing how much space to give. And I was not used to that kind of control from someone else, and I sat down when indicated, my hands resting lightly on my lap before instinct pulled one back to my stomach again, a habit that had become second nature without me noticing. And the doctor spoke, her voice steady, reassuring, explaining what would happen next in simple terms that should have calmed me. But my focus kept drifting, not to fear, not exactly, but to awareness, to the fact that this was real now in a way I could not push aside anymore. And I glanced up briefly, just once, and my eyes found his. And he was watching, not the room, not the doctor, just me, his expression unchanged but his attention absolute, like he was measuring something I could not see, like he was making sure I did not disappear into the moment. And I looked away quickly, not because I felt threatened, but because I felt seen in a way I was not prepared for. And the doctor continued, asking questions, simple, clinical, things I answered automatically, dates, symptoms, details that turned something abstract into something defined, something measurable, and each answer felt like a step deeper into a reality I had been skimming the surface of until now. And then she nodded once, satisfied, and the room shifted again, not physically, but in tone, like we had reached the point where words were no longer enough, where confirmation mattered more than explanation. And I felt my breath slow, my fingers curling slightly against the edge of the chair as I focused on the ceiling for a moment, grounding myself in something neutral, something steady. And then it happened, quiet at first, almost unnoticeable, a soft rhythm that did not belong to the room, that did not belong to anything external. And my eyes closed instinctively as the sound settled into something recognizable, something real, something undeniable, and everything else faded for a second, the tension, the uncertainty, the questions, all of it dissolving into that one steady beat that existed independent of everything else. And my throat tightened unexpectedly, not from fear, not from doubt, but from something else entirely, something deeper, something that made this moment heavier and clearer at the same time. And I did not realize I had reached for the edge of the chair harder until I felt a shift. Beside me, subtle but present, and when I opened my eyes, he was closer, not touching, but near enough that I could feel the difference, and I turned slightly, just enough to see his expression. And for the first time since I had met him, there was something there I had not seen before, not weakness, not softness, but something quieter, something that felt like recognition. Like this moment mattered to him in a way that went beyond control or responsibility. And he did not say anything, did not break the silence with unnecessary words. He just stayed there, present. And that alone steadied me more than anything the doctor had said. And I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding, my hand moving again, this time not out of instinct, but out of connection, resting where I now understood there was more than just uncertainty, more than just a possibility. And the sound continued, steady, consistent, grounding, and I felt something shift inside me, something settling into place, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to change the way I was standing in this moment, enough to make everything feel less abstract, less distant, more immediate, more real. And when the doctor finally spoke again, her voice softer now, confirming what I had already begun to understand, I nodded slowly, not because I needed to agree, but because I was acknowledging it fully for the first time. And I sat there for a second longer than necessary after everything had been explained, after the room had quieted again, after the sound had faded back into memory, and I realized something I had not been able to admit before. I was no longer standing at the edge of this. I was in it, fully, undeniably, and I glanced toward him again, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to understand what this looked like from his perspective. What this meant to someone who approached everything with certainty, with control, and his gaze met mine immediately, like he had been waiting for it, like he had not looked away, and there was no question in his expression, no uncertainty, just acknowledgement, like this had confirmed something he had already believed. And he spoke then, his voice low but clear. "Everything is as it should be," he said. And the simplicity of that statement grounded me in a way I had not expected, because it did not try to redefine the moment, did not add pressure or expectation, it just placed it where it belonged, in reality, in fact, in something we could both stand on without questioning, and I nodded slightly, because there was nothing else to say, nothing that would make this more or less real. And as I stood up, the room felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, like something had come into focus that had been blurred before. And I realized something quietly. This was no longer about whether I could handle it alone. This was about how I chose to move forward knowing I did not have to. And that distinction mattered more than I had expected, more than I was ready to fully accept. And as we moved toward the door, his presence beside me felt different now, not just controlled, not just deliberate, but connected, like this was no longer just an intersection of two separate paths, but the beginning of something shared, whether I was ready for that or not. And that thought stayed with me as we stepped back into the hallway, as the door closed quietly behind us, as the world outside this room waited unchanged while everything inside me had shifted into something I could not ignore anymore. The hallway felt longer on the way out, like every step carried more weight than it had just minutes ago, and I walked beside him in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said without words, confirmed in a quiet room with a steady sound that I could still hear in the back of my mind. And my hand rested lightly against my stomach again, not out of habit this time, but with intention, with awareness, like I was acknowledging something that no longer felt distant or abstract, and I became aware of the rhythm of our steps, his measured, precise, mine slightly slower, more careful, and he adjusted without comment, without making it obvious, just enough to match my pace. And that small detail stayed with me, because it was not something he needed to do, but something he chose to do, and that distinction mattered more than I expected, and we reached the exit, the doors opening quietly as we approached, the transition from controlled interior to open air seamless, and the late afternoon light hit differently now, softer somehow, like everything outside had remained the same, while something inside me had shifted completely, and I paused for a second at the top of the steps. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to, because I needed a moment to recalibrate, to understand how to step back into a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. And he stopped beside me without question, without prompting, simply allowing the pause to exist, and I glanced at him briefly, noticing the way his gaze moved across the street, the surroundings, not in a distracted way, but in a way that felt aware, controlled, like he was always assessing, always accounting for variables I could not see. And it made me realize something I had not fully considered before. His world was not just about power. It was about responsibility, about control, over things most people never even noticed. And that understanding settled quietly in my mind as I looked forward again, the city stretching out in front of us, familiar but different, like I was seeing it from a new perspective, and I exhaled slowly, grounding myself before speaking. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice steady, but carrying more weight than before, because this was no longer a hypothetical question. This was real, immediate, something that required an answer, and he did not respond right away, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing his words, shaping them with the same precision he applied to everything else. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, certain, but not imposing. "Now we move forward," he said, and I let out a small breath. Almost a laugh, not from humor, but from the simplicity of it, because that answer could mean anything, everything, and I turned slightly toward him. "That is not very specific," I replied, and there was the faintest shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close, something that acknowledged the moment without diminishing it. Specificity comes after structure, he said, and I frowned slightly, trying to follow the logic, trying to understand the framework he was applying to something that felt personal, emotional, uncertain, and he continued, his tone even, measured. We establish what is necessary first, then we decide how to proceed, he explained, and I nodded slowly, not because I fully agreed, but because I understood the approach, because it was consistent with everything I had seen from him so far, control before action, clarity before movement, and I crossed my arms lightly, more out of thought than defense. And what is necessary? I asked, and this time his answer came without pause. Your health, he said, direct, immediate, the child's health, and then, after the briefest moment, and your safety. And that last word lingered slightly, not emphasized, but present in a way that made me look at him more closely, because it felt like it carried more meaning than the others, and I tilted my head slightly. My safety, I repeated, and he met my gaze without hesitation. You are not invisible, he said, simply, and something about that phrasing made my chest tighten slightly, because I had spent so long trying to stay unnoticed, trying to keep things quiet, contained, manageable, and the idea that I was now visible, that this situation was something that could be seen, recognized, acknowledged by others, unsettled me in a way I had not expected, and I shook my head slightly, trying to dismiss the thought. No one knows, I said, almost instinctively, but his expression did not change, did not soften, did not contradict me outright. He just held my gaze with that same quiet certainty. That is not something we assume, he replied. And the calmness of his tone made it clear that this was not a possibility to him. It was a variable, something to be considered, accounted for, managed, and I felt a small part of me resist the idea that this had already extended beyond me, beyond my control, but another part of me recognized the logic, recognized that my perspective had been limited to what I could see, what I could control, and has extended far beyond that, and I exhaled slowly, my hand dropping back to my side. As I considered his words, so you are saying I need protection? I asked, and the word felt strange in my mouth, unfamiliar, like something that did not belong to me, and he did not respond immediately, not rejecting it, not confirming it outright, just considering, and then he nodded once, small, precise. I am saying you will not navigate this alone, he said, and that phrasing mattered, because it was not about restriction, not about control, it was about presence, about involvement, about a shared responsibility that I was still trying to fully accept. And I looked away for a second, down at the street below, at the movement of people going about their lives, unaware of how much mine had just shifted, and I felt that contradiction again, the pull between independence and something else, something that felt steadier, more structured, more certain, and I turned back to him, meeting his gaze fully this time. And what if I want to handle it on my own terms? I asked, and there was no challenge in my voice, just honesty, just a need to understand where I stood in all of this. And his response came without hesitation, without conflict. Then we define those terms, he said, and that answer caught me off guard more than anything else had, because it did not oppose me, did not override me. It adapted, it integrated, it found a way to align instead of divide. And I felt something shift in my chest, something that felt like trust, not fully formed, not complete, but present, and I nodded slowly, because for the first time since all of this had started, I did not feel like I was losing control, I felt like I was redefining it, and that difference mattered more than I could put into words. And as we stood there, the city moving around us, the world, continuing as if nothing had changed, I realized something quietly. This was not just about what had happened, this was about what came next, about how I chose to step into it, about who I allowed to stand beside me. And for the first time, that choice did not feel like a loss. It felt like something else entirely, something stronger, something more certain, something I was only beginning to understand. The silence between us did not feel empty anymore. It felt intentional, like something was being built in the space where words were not necessary. And I stood there at the top of the steps a moment longer, letting everything settle, letting his words echo in a way that was quieter now, but more grounded, and I realized I was no longer trying to push back against the situation. I was trying to understand how to exist within it without losing myself, and that shift was subtle but significant, and I looked down at my hands for a second, noticing how they were no longer tense, no longer clenched around uncertainty, but resting more naturally, like my body had caught up to something my mind was still processing. And when I looked back up at him, his attention had not wavered, not distracted, not impatient, just steady, and that steadiness did something unexpected. It made me feel like I had time even when everything about him suggested urgency, and I exhaled slowly. You plan everything, do not you? I asked, not as an accusation, but as an observation, and there was the faintest shift in his expression, something that acknowledged the truth of it without needing to confirm it out loud. I prepare for what matters, he replied, and that answer landed differently than I expected, because it was not about control for the sake of control. It was about prioritization, about knowing what deserved attention and acting accordingly, and I tilted my head slightly, considering that. And this matters? I asked, and the question felt heavier than it sounded, because it was not just about the situation, it was about me, about what I represented in his world, about where I stood in something I had not asked to be part of, but was now undeniably connected to, and his gaze did not shift, did not soften, did not hesitate. Yes, he said, simply, and there was no elaboration, no justification, just certainty. And that certainty settled in my chest in a way I could not ignore, because it was not dependent on anything I did or said. It just existed. And I looked away for a second, out at the street again, letting that sit with me, letting myself feel it without immediately reacting, and I realized something quietly. I had spent so much time questioning whether I was enough, whether I was seen, whether I mattered in ways that went beyond surface level. And now I was standing here with someone who did not question it at all, who treated it like a given, and that should have felt overwhelming. But instead it felt stabilizing, like something I had been missing without knowing it, and I shifted my weight slightly, turning back toward him. You keep saying we, I said, and this time there was a slight edge to my voice, not defensive, but searching. What does that actually mean? And he did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing how to define something that was still forming. And when he spoke, his voice was just as measured as before, but there was something more deliberate in it now. It means this is not separate, he said, and I frowned slightly, trying to follow the layers behind that statement. And he continued, what affects you affects me. And there it was again, that directness, that refusal to complicate something that could be stated simply, and I felt my breath catch slightly, not because I did not understand, but because I did, because it removed the distance I had been trying to maintain, because it made this shared in a way I could not redefine on my own, and I crossed my arms lightly, not as a barrier, but as a way to contain the thoughts moving through me. You say that like it is obvious, I said, and there was no challenge in it, just acknowledgement of how differently we were approaching this, and he nodded once, small, precise. It is, he replied, and I let out a slow breath, a small shake of my head following, not in disagreement, but in recognition of the gap between how I had been thinking and how he operated. And I stepped down one of the stairs, then another, needing movement, needing something physical to match the shift happening internally, and he followed without comment, matching my pace again without making it obvious, and we reached the sidewalk together, the city moving around us, unchanged, unaware, and I turned to face him fully this time, not at an angle, not partially, but directly, because if this was going to continue, if this was going to be something real, then I needed clarity, not just from him, but from myself. I am not part of your world, I said, and the statement felt important, not as a rejection, but as a truth, something that needed to be acknowledged before anything else could be defined. And his expression did not shift, did not dismiss it. He just listened, fully, completely, and that alone made it easier to continue. I do not know how any of this works, I added, and my voice was steady, but honest, without the usual instinct to mask uncertainty. And there was a brief pause, not empty, just present, and then he spoke. You are not expected to, he said, and that answer caught me off guard, because it removed a pressure I had not realized I was placing on myself, the idea that I needed to understand everything immediately, that I needed to adapt instantly to something unfamiliar. And I studied him for a second, looking for something else in his expression, something that would complicate that statement. But there was nothing, just that same steady certainty, and I nodded slowly. Then what am I expected to do? I asked, and this time the question felt simpler, more grounded, because I was no longer asking from a place of resistance, but from a place of understanding, and his response came just as simply. Be honest, he said, and I blinked slightly, not because it was complicated, but because it was not, because it was something I could do, something I was already trying to do, and I let out a small breath, something close to a laugh but quieter. That seems manageable, I admitted, and there was that faint shift in his expression again, something that acknowledged the moment without needing to define it, and the air between us felt different now, less tense, less uncertain, not because everything was resolved, but because something had been established, something clear, something we could both stand on without questioning. And I realized something then. This was not about losing control, it was about sharing it in a way that did not diminish me, that did not override me, but expanded the space I was operating in, and that realization settled quietly, firmly, like something I would not unlearn, and I looked at him one more time, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without the instinct to look away, and for the first time since all of this began, I felt steady. Not because I had all the answers, but because I knew I did not have to find them alone, and that changed everything in a way I was only beginning to understand. For a moment, neither of us moved, and it was not awkward, not forced, just still, like we had reached a point where rushing forward would have broken something that was only just beginning to take shape, and I became aware of how differently I was standing now, shoulders relaxed, breath steady, my hand no longer hovering uncertainly, but resting with quiet intention, and it surprised me how quickly that shift had happened, how something that felt overwhelming just hours ago had settled into something I could actually hold, something I could understand piece by piece instead of all at once. And I looked at him again, really looked this time, not just at the way he carried himself or the quiet authority that seemed to follow him without effort, but at the details, the way his focus never fractured, the way he listened without interrupting, the way he adjusted without announcing it. And I realized something I had not expected. This was not just control, this was awareness, a constant, deliberate awareness of everything around him, and that included me now, and that thought should have made me step back, should have made me question what it meant to be seen that clearly, but instead it made me feel grounded, like I was no longer trying to prove anything, no longer trying to fit into someone else's expectations, and I shifted slightly, turning my body, so I was no longer half facing the street, no longer half looking for an exit, but fully present in the moment, fully engaged, and the difference was subtle but real, and I could feel it in the way he responded, not with words, but with stillness, like he recognized the change without needing to acknowledge it. And I let out a slow breath. There is something I need to be clear about, I said, and my voice was steady, not defensive, not hesitant, just firm, because if this was going to work, whatever this was, it needed to be built on something real, something defined, and his gaze did not waver, did not interrupt, just stayed with me, fully attentive, and that made it easier to continue. I am not going to be controlled, I said, and the words came out clean, without apology, without softening, because they were not meant to challenge him, they were meant to define me. And there was a brief pause, not tension, just space, and then he nodded once, small, precise, like he had expected that, like it aligned with something he had already understood. Nor should you be, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer caught me off guard, not because it contradicted me, but because it did not, because it met me exactly where I stood without trying to shift me, and I studied him for a second, looking for something beneath that, something that would complicate it, but there was nothing, just that same steady certainty, and I felt something inside me settle further, like another piece falling into place, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging that, before continuing. And I am not going to disappear into your life, I added, and this time there was a slight edge to my voice, not sharp, but intentional, because that mattered, because I had spent too long shaping myself around other people's expectations, and I was not going to do that again, not even in a situation like this. And again, he did not interrupt, did not dismiss it, just listened, and when I finished, he responded just as evenly. You will not, he said, and there was no hesitation, no negotiation, just agreement. And that steadiness did something unexpected. It made me feel heard without having to defend my position, and I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension I had not realized I was holding ease slightly. And I glanced down for a second, my hand moving again, resting lightly where I now knew there was more than just uncertainty, more than just a possibility. And I looked back up at him. But I also know this is not just about me anymore, I said. And that was the part that felt different, the part that had changed everything, the part that had shifted my decisions from individual to shared. And his gaze softened just slightly, not in expression, but in focus, like he was acknowledging that shift with me, not ahead of me, not behind me, but alongside. And I felt my breath steady again. So if we are doing this, I continued, choosing my words carefully, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted them to be clear. It has to be balanced. And the word felt right, not perfect, not complete, but right. And he nodded once more, slower this time, more deliberate. It will be, he said, and there was something in his tone that made that feel less like a promise and more like a decision, something already set into motion. And I let that sit for a second, letting myself accept it instead of questioning it. And I realized something quietly. I was no longer trying to push him out of this. I was trying to define how he stayed in it. And that shift mattered more than anything else. And I took a small step forward, closing the distance just slightly, not intentionally, not calculated, just natural. And I noticed he did not step back, did not adjust away. He simply remained where he was, steady, present. And that lack of reaction felt more significant than any movement could have. And I met his gaze again, fully, without hesitation, without the instinct to look away. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was standing across from him. I felt like I was standing with him. Not completely, not entirely, but enough to recognize the difference. And the city moved around us, cars passing, people talking, the normal rhythm of everything continuing as if nothing had changed. But I knew better, because everything had, not in a dramatic, overwhelming way, but in a steady, undeniable way that would not reverse itself. And I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest, something that did not need to be spoken to exist, something that did not depend on the outcome, just on the fact that I was choosing to step forward instead of stepping back. And I realized something then. This was not about losing control or gaining it. It was about redefining it in a way that made space for something new, something I had not planned, something I had not expected, but something that felt right in a way I could not explain. And as I stood there, looking at him, feeling the shift that had taken place between us, I understood something clearly for the first time. This was not temporary. This was not something that would fade when the moment passed. This was the beginning of something that would change everything, whether I was ready for it or not. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to resist that. The moment stretched just a second longer before something shifted again, not between us this time, but around us, like the world was reminding me it had not stopped, that everything outside this quiet space we had created was still moving forward. And I became aware of it all at once, the distant honk of a car, the low murmur of voices, the rhythm of footsteps passing by. And it felt different now, like I was standing in the same place, but seeing it from a new angle. And I drew in a slow breath, steadying myself as that awareness settled in. Because this was where things became real in a different way, not just between us, but in how this would exist beyond this moment. And I shifted my weight slightly, my hand brushing against my coat pocket where the card still rested, a small reminder of how quickly everything had changed. And I looked at him again, more carefully this time, not just at the presence he carried, but at the intention behind it, the way he remained still, without being passive, attentive without being intrusive. And I realized something quietly. He was waiting, not for permission, not for direction, but for me to decide what came next. And that recognition settled in a way that felt both grounding and unsettling at the same time, because it meant the next step was mine to define, not his. And I exhaled slowly, letting that responsibility settle instead of avoiding it. I need to go home, I said, and the words felt simple, but they carried more weight than they should have, because home did not feel like the same place it had been this morning. It felt like something I needed to return to with a different understanding. And he nodded once. Immediate. No hesitation. Of course, he replied. And there was no attempt to redirect, no suggestion of anything else, just acceptance. and that alone reinforced what I had just realized. This was not about taking over my decisions, it was about standing within them, and I felt a small sense of relief settle in, quiet but real, and I turned slightly toward the street, taking a step forward before pausing again, something still unfinished in the air between us, something I needed to address before leaving, and I glanced back at him. This does not change everything overnight, I said, and my tone was steady, not defensive, just clear, because I needed that boundary, needed to define the pace at which this would unfold, and he held my gaze without interruption, without disagreement, and then nodded once, slower this time, more deliberate. No, he said, it does not. And there was no argument in it, no pushback, just acknowledgement, and that made it easier to continue. I am going to take this one step at a time, I added, and there was a small pause after the words, like I was giving him space to respond, to challenge it if he needed to, but he did not. He simply said, as you should, and that alignment, that consistency, did something I had not expected. It made me trust the space between us a little more, because it was not being forced, it was being built, intentionally, steadily, and I nodded slightly, accepting that before turning back toward the street fully, and the car was already there, waiting, like it had never left, like it had been part of this moment from the beginning, and I hesitated for just a second before moving toward it, not because I was unsure, but because I was aware of what it represented now, not just transportation, but connection, continuity, something that extended beyond a single conversation, and I reached for the door, but before I opened it, I turned back one last time, meeting his gaze across the small distance between us, and for a second neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to define, nothing left to clarify in that moment. Everything that needed to be said had already been established in quieter ways, and I realized something. Then, this was not a conclusion, this was a transition, a shift from uncertainty into something more structured, something that would unfold over time instead of all at once, and I held his gaze just a second longer before speaking. I will call you, I said, and the words felt different now than they had earlier, less like a possibility, more like a decision, and he nodded once, the same calm certainty in his expression. I know, he replied, and there was no doubt in it, no question, just a quiet confidence that made the words feel less like an obligation and more like something inevitable, and I let out a slow breath, something steady settling in my chest as I turned back to the car and opened the door, sliding into the seat with a sense of awareness that had not been there before, and as the door closed behind me, I glanced out the window one last time, watching him for a brief moment, the way he remained where he was, composed, unmoving, like he did not need to follow, did not need to ensure anything beyond what had already been set in motion, and that image stayed with me as the car pulled away from the curb, the distance between us increasing gradually, but not in a way that felt like separation, more like space being created for what came next, and I leaned back slightly against the seat, my hand resting again where it had so often found its place, but this time it felt different, not protective, not uncertain, but steady, intentional, like I was no longer reacting to what was happening, but stepping into it, and I looked out at the city as it moved past the window, familiar streets taking on a different meaning now, because I was not the same person moving through them anymore, and I realized something. Quietly, this was only the beginning, not just of a situation, not just of a connection, but of a change that would reach further than I could see from here, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to predict it, to control it, to understand every outcome before taking the next step. I just let it exist, let it unfold, and that alone felt like the biggest shift of all. The city blurred past the window in soft streaks of light and shadow, familiar streets folding into one another as the car moved steadily forward, and I rested my head lightly against the glass for a moment, watching reflections overlap with reality, my own face faintly visible against everything passing by, and it felt strange, seeing myself like that, because I did not look different, not really, but I felt different in a way that could not be seen from the outside, like something had shifted. Beneath the surface, something steady and irreversible, and my hand moved again without thinking, resting where it had so naturally begun to stay, and this time I did not question it, did not analyze it. I just let it be, because for the first time since everything began, I was not trying to figure out what came next, I was letting the moment exist as it was, and that quiet acceptance settled in slowly, like a breath I had been holding for too long finally releasing, and the car turned onto my street, the buildings becoming more familiar, more grounded, the kind of ordinary that used to feel like routine, but now felt like something I needed to reconnect with. And as we slowed to a stop in front of my apartment, I straightened slightly, my reflection shifting in the glass as reality came back into sharper focus, and the driver stepped out, opening the door with the same quiet efficiency as before. And I stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool air brushing against my skin in a way that felt more noticeable now, more present, and I stood there for a second, looking up at the building, the same worn brick, the same narrow windows, the same chipped paint on the entry door. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. And I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers brushing against the cardigan before I let them fall away, because I did not need to look at it anymore. I already knew what it meant, and I turned toward the driver slightly, offering a small nod. "Thank you," I said, and he inclined his head in return. No unnecessary words, just acknowledgement, and the car pulled away as quietly as it had arrived, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk. And for a moment I just stood there, listening to the distant sounds of the city, letting the quiet settle in around me. Because this was the first moment since everything had begun where I was completely by myself again. No presence beside me, no steady gaze grounding me, no voice shaping the next step, just me. And the shift was noticeable immediately, not in a negative way, but in a way that made me realize how much had changed in such a short amount of time. And I took a slow breath before walking toward the building, my steps measured, deliberate, like I was relearning how to move through a space that used to feel automatic. And I pushed the door open, the familiar creak greeting me, the faint scent of old wood, and something warm and lived-in settling around me. And I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand brushing against the railing, the texture grounding, real, steady. And when I reached my apartment door, I paused for a second, my hand resting on the handle, because I understood something in that moment. Once I stepped inside, everything would feel more real in a different way, quieter, less defined by external structure, and more shaped by my own thoughts, my own understanding of what had just happened. And I turned the handle slowly, stepping inside, and the apartment greeted me exactly as I had left it, small, simple, familiar, the couch slightly out of place, a mug on the counter, a stack of papers I had not finished sorting, all of it unchanged. And I closed the door behind me with a soft click, the sound echoing slightly in the quiet space. And I leaned back against it for a second, letting the stillness settle fully, because this was where everything had started, where I had been trying to process things on my own, where I had been holding everything in a kind of suspended uncertainty. And now I was back here, but I was not the same. And that realization moved through me slowly, not overwhelming, just steady. And I pushed myself away from the door, moving further into the apartment, my steps softer now, more aware. And I set my bag down on the counter, the sound small but grounding. And I glanced around, taking in the details I had ignored before, the way the light filtered through the window, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the stillness that now felt less like isolation and more like space to think, to feel, to understand. And I walked over to the couch, sitting down slowly, my hands resting in my lap for a moment before one moved again, settling where it had become familiar. And I closed my eyes briefly, letting everything replay in fragments, the cafe, the words, the shift, the clinic, the sound, his voice, his presence, all of it layering together into something that no longer felt chaotic, but structured in a way I was only beginning to understand. And I opened my eyes again, staring at the wall in front of me, but not really seeing it, because my thoughts were moving somewhere else, somewhere quieter, deeper. And I realized something then. This was the first time I was truly alone with this new reality, without distraction, without interruption. And instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt steady, not completely certain, not fully resolved, but grounded in a way I had not been before. And that surprised me more than anything else, because I had expected fear, uncertainty, maybe even panic. But what I felt instead was a kind of quiet clarity, like something had aligned that I had been struggling to piece together on my own. And I leaned back slightly, letting my shoulders relax into the couch, my breath slow and even. and I let the silence stretch, not filling it with noise, not reaching for my phone, not trying to distract myself, just letting it exist. And in that silence, I understood something clearly for the first time. I was not facing this alone anymore. Not because someone had taken control, not because I had given anything up, but because I had allowed someone to stand beside me without losing myself in the process. And that distinction mattered more than anything else. And I sat there for a long moment, letting that understanding settle fully, letting it become something real, something I could carry forward. And when I finally moved, reaching for my phone on the table beside me, it was not out of uncertainty, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because I knew this was not something that would stay contained within this apartment. Within this moment, it was something that would continue, something that would unfold, and for the first time, I felt ready to step into that, not perfectly, not completely, but with enough clarity to take the next step. Without looking back, the phone felt heavier in my hand than it should have, like it carried more than just a number, more than just the possibility of a call, and I sat there on the couch for a moment longer, staring at the screen without unlocking it, because I understood something now that I had not before. This was not about reacting anymore. This was about choosing, and that difference mattered, because every choice I made from here would shape something that extended beyond just me, beyond just today, and I let out a slow breath, my thumb hovering over the screen before I finally unlocked it, the light casting a soft glow across the room, and I found his number without needing to search, like my mind had already stored it somewhere deeper than memory. And for a second I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because once I made this call, I was stepping further into something that was already unfolding, something that would not pause or wait for me to catch up, and I realized I did not need to be completely ready. I just needed to be willing to move forward, and that thought steadied me in a way that surprised me, and I pressed call before I could overthink it, the sound of the line connecting filling the quiet space around me, and it rang once, then again, and then his voice came through, immediate, like he had been expecting it. Even now, Ava, he said, and hearing my name like that, calm, certain, grounded, made something in my chest settle, like the distance between where I was and where this was going had shortened just slightly. I made it home, I said, and the words felt simple, almost unnecessary, but they mattered, because they established something, continuity, connection, and there was a brief pause. On the other end, not silence, but acknowledgement. Good, he replied, and there was something in that single word that felt deliberate, like he had been waiting for that confirmation, like it mattered more than he was saying, and I leaned back slightly against the couch, my hand resting again where it had naturally begun to stay, grounding myself in the present moment. I have been thinking, I continued, and that was an understatement, because my thoughts had not stopped since everything began. They had just shifted from chaos to something more structured, more intentional, and he did not interrupt, did not fill the space. Just let me continue, and that alone made it easier to speak. About what this means, I said, choosing my words carefully, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted them to be clear, and there was no hesitation in his response. And he asked, and it was not a demand, not a push, just an opening, and I exhaled slowly, letting the words come without overanalyzing them. It means I cannot pretend this is temporary, I said, and as soon as I said it, I felt something settle in my chest, something solid, something real, because that had been the piece I was avoiding, the idea that this was not just a moment, not just a situation that would pass. This was something that would continue, that would grow, that would require decisions and actions beyond what I was used to making. And there was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation, but something closer to agreement. No, he said, you cannot. And the way he said it did not feel harsh, did not feel final in a limiting way. It felt honest, like he was acknowledging the same reality from a different perspective, and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it, because I understood that now, not just logically, but fully, and I shifted slightly on the couch, adjusting my position as I leaned forward, my elbows resting lightly on my knees, grounding myself further. But it also means I need to understand where I stand, I added, and this was the part that mattered, the part that would define everything else moving forward. And his response came without delay. You stand where you choose to, he said, and I blinked slightly, not because I did not understand, but because I had not expected that answer, because it placed the decision back in my hands instead of defining it for me. And I let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh. You make it sound simple, I said, and there was a subtle shift in his tone when he replied, not lighter, but more precise. It is not simple, he said, but it is clear, and that distinction stayed with me, because it meant I did not have to understand everything immediately. I just had to be honest about what I was choosing, and I let that settle for a second before speaking again. Then I am choosing not to disappear, I said, and the words felt stronger this time, more certain, because they were not just a boundary, they were a direction, and there was no pause in his response, no hesitation, just acknowledgement. Good, he said, and again, that single word carried more weight than it should have, because it was not approval, it was agreement, alignment, and I felt something shift slightly, something that felt like stability, like we were no longer moving in separate directions trying to meet in the middle, but standing on the same ground, and I took a slow breath, my gaze drifting toward the window as the light outside softened, the day moving toward evening, without waiting for me to catch up, and I realized something quietly. This was how it would be now, not rushed, not forced, but constant, unfolding step by step, decision by decision, and I brought my focus back. But I am also not going to rush into something I do not understand yet, I added, and this time there was a slight pause before he responded, not disagreement, but consideration, and then he said, you will not be asked to. And that answer settled something in me, something I had not fully recognized until that moment, the fear of being pulled into something faster than I could process, and I nodded again, more to myself than to him. Then we take it one step at a time, I said, and it was not a question, not a suggestion, it was a statement, something I was setting into place, and his response came just as steadily. We do, he said, and the simplicity of that alignment made everything feel manageable, not easy, not predictable, but possible, and I leaned back again, letting my shoulders relax into the couch, my breath steady, even, and I realized something then. This was not about having all the answers. It was about building something that could hold the questions without breaking, something that could evolve without losing its foundation, and I felt a quiet sense of clarity settle in, not complete, not final, but enough to take the next step without hesitation. And as the call continued, not filled with unnecessary words, but with presence, with understanding, I knew something for certain. Whatever this was becoming, it was not something I was walking into blindly anymore. It was something I was choosing, and that choice changed everything. The line stayed open for a few seconds after the last words settled between us, not silent, not empty, just present, like neither of us felt the need to fill it with anything unnecessary, and I realized that was something new for me. This kind of quiet that did not demand explanation, that did not feel like something was missing, but like everything important had already been acknowledged, and I let out a slow breath, my gaze drifting toward the window where the last of the daylight was fading into something softer, something steadier, and I could feel it in myself too. That same transition, from uncertainty into something more grounded, not fully defined, but no longer unstable, and I shifted slightly on the couch, my hand resting where it had become familiar, not out of habit anymore, but with intention, with awareness, and I spoke again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to close this moment clearly. This changes things, I said, and my voice was calm, steady, not questioning, just stating what had already become obvious, and there was no hesitation in his response, no attempt to soften it or redirect it. Yes, he said, and the certainty in that single word did not feel overwhelming anymore. It felt accurate, like we were both standing in the same understanding without needing to define every detail of it, and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it, because I felt that too, not as something heavy, but as something real, something that would shape what came next whether I tried to control it or not, and I leaned back again, letting my shoulders settle into the couch, my breath steady, and I realized something quietly. I was not afraid of that anymore, not in the way I had been before, because I was no longer facing it alone, and that distinction had changed everything in a way I was only beginning to understand, and I glanced down for a second, my fingers tracing lightly against the fabric of my sweater, grounding myself in the present, before lifting my gaze again, even though he could not see it, because the connection did not feel limited to sight. It felt established, like something that existed beyond the immediate moment, and I spoke once more. But it does not change who I am. I added, and this time there was a slight edge to my tone, not defensive, but firm, because that mattered, because I needed to say it out loud, not just for him, but for myself. And there was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation, but acknowledgement. And then he replied, "It should not." And the simplicity of that answer settled something in me that I had not fully recognized until now, because it confirmed what I had been trying to hold on to, that this was not about losing myself in something bigger. It was about expanding what I already was without compromising it. And I let out a slow breath, something steady, something grounded, and I realized something then. This was the balance I had been searching for, not control versus surrender, not independence versus connection, but something in between, something that allowed both to exist without conflict. And I shifted slightly, sitting up straighter now, not out of tension, but out of clarity, and I felt a small, quiet sense of certainty settle in my chest, something that did not need to be loud to be real. And I spoke again, softer this time, but no less certain. "I am not going anywhere," I said, and the words felt different than they would have hours ago, not reactive, not defensive, but intentional, like I was choosing to stay in this moment, in this situation, in this connection, instead of stepping back from it. And there was no immediate response, no interruption, just a brief pause that felt deliberate. And then his voice came through again, just as steady, just as certain. "Neither am I," he said, and something in that response settled deeper than anything else had, because it was not a promise in the traditional sense. It was not conditional. It was not something that needed to be proven. It was simply stated, like a fact, like something already decided, already set in motion, and I felt my breath catch slightly before it steadied again, because that kind of certainty was not something I was used to, not in this way, not without pressure or expectation attached to it. And I leaned back once more, letting the quiet return between us. But it felt different now, fuller, more defined, like something had been completed without needing to be explained. And I closed my eyes briefly, just for a second, letting everything settle, the conversation, the day, the shift that had taken place in ways I could not fully articulate yet. And when I opened them again, the room felt the same, but I did not. And that difference mattered more than anything else. And I spoke one last time, not because I needed to continue, but because I wanted to end this moment with clarity, with intention. "Then we will figure it out," I said, and the words felt simple, but they carried something deeper, something that acknowledged both the uncertainty and the willingness to move through it anyway. And there was no hesitation in his response, no complication, just agreement. "We will," he said, and that was enough, more than enough. And I let the silence settle after that, not rushing to fill it, not extending the moment unnecessarily, because it felt complete. And I lowered the phone slowly, ending the call without any dramatic shift, just a quiet transition back into my own space, my own thoughts, my own understanding of what had just been established. And I sat there for a moment longer, the room still, the air calm, and I realized something clearly. This was not an ending. This was not even a beginning in the traditional sense. It was a continuation, a shift from one version of my life into another, that I was now actively choosing. And that choice was what mattered most, not the uncertainty, not the unknowns, but the fact that I was stepping into it with awareness instead of hesitation. And I let out a slow breath, my hand resting where it had become familiar, not out of instinct, but out of connection. And I looked around the apartment again, seeing it not as a place I was confined to, but as a place I was moving forward from. And that distinction changed everything. And as the quiet settled fully around me, I understood something that felt both simple and profound at the same time. I had not lost control of my life. I had redefined it. And that was something I would carry with me into whatever came next.